They held him down. His screams were drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the hiss of molten gold. The searing metal glowed like the sun itself as it was lifted toward his mouth. He thrashed, desperate, but there was no escape. This wasn't just execution, it was humiliation forged in fire, a punishment born from greed, pride, and betrayal. And as the gold poured down his throat, it was as though the gods themselves were mocking him. This was the death of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. But how did the wealthiest man in the ancient world end up dying in such a grotesque, symbolic way? What chain of arrogance and ambition led him from the marble halls of Rome to a battlefield in the desert, where his lust for glory would quite literally be drowned in gold? Today, we uncover the story of a man whose hunger for wealth and power rivaled even Caesar's, and whose downfall became one of the most infamous deaths in history. Welcome to Chronicles of Cruelty, where we unearth the darkest, most twisted stories from the past, tales where ambition meets its brutal reckoning. If you have a fascination for the grimmer side of history, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next descent into humanity's shadows. To understand Crassus's horrifying fate, we first have to understand who he was, the man behind the myth. In a Rome dominated by legends like Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, Crassus was the third pillar of power, but also the most despised. His name was synonymous with gold. His houses overflowed with silver. He financed armies, bought senators, and could even raise entire legions with his fortune alone. Yet to him, it wasn't enough. For Crassus, wealth wasn't the goal. It was the weapon. He used it to buy loyalty, influence politics, and carve out power in a city that worshipped conquest. But there was one thing he could never buy: glory. Rome's highest honor wasn't wealth. It was victory. Caesar had it. Pompey had it. Crassus wanted it more than life itself, and that hunger would destroy him. Marcus Licinius Crassus wasn't born into power. He built it brick by brick, fire by fire, corpse by corpse. During the chaos of Rome's civil wars, when Sulla's armies turned the streets into rivers of blood, Crassus saw opportunity where others saw ruin. While aristocrats fled and homes burned, he bought up the ashes. Literally. He purchased the charred remains of estates for pennies, rebuilt them with slave labor, and sold them back for fortunes. Rome rose again, and Crassus owned half of it. By the time the Republic had regained its breath, Crassus had transformed from scavenger to kingmaker. He had more gold than the state treasury. Senators owed him their careers, even generals borrowed from him to fund their ambitions, but behind the polished smile and political charm was a man who feared obscurity more than death. Caesar had captured the hearts of the people, Pompey the glory of the legions. Crassus had everything, except honor. And in Rome, without honor, even the richest man was nothing. He tried to change that once before. When the slave rebellion led by Spartacus erupted, Crassus volunteered to crush it, not for Rome, but for himself. His command was brutal, efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy. When he finally captured the remnants of Spartacus's army, he ordered 6,000 prisoners crucified along the Appian Way. The road from Capua to Rome became a corridor of agony, lined with rotting corpses as a warning to anyone who dared rise again. It was horror turned spectacle, and in the eyes of Rome, it worked. Crassus, the banker, had become Crassus, the conqueror, but still he was overshadowed. Pompey swooped in at the last moment, claiming partial credit for the victory and bathing in the public's adoration. Crassus smiled through gritted teeth, but the resentment burned. He would never forget that taste of humiliation. Years later, the Republic was collapsing under its own weight, torn between ambition and greed. Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey formed a fragile alliance, the first triumvirate. Together, they ruled Rome through manipulation, money, and brute force. But alliances built on ego are doomed to crumble. Caesar gained unprecedented fame in Gaul, Pompey remained a hero of the East, and Crassus, he became the forgotten third wheel. His wealth had bought him a seat at the table, but not respect. That's when he made a decision that would change history forever. He would conquer his own empire, an empire richer than Rome itself. The Parthians, rulers of the vast lands to the east, were the inheritors of Persia's might and masters of the trade routes that connected east and west. To Crassus, their gold, their silks, their cities gleaming under desert suns, all of it screamed opportunity, and most of all, victory. He convinced himself it would be an easy campaign, a short war to rival Caesar's glories. He would march east, crush the Parthians, and return to Rome as a hero. But he was marching straight into a grave. The year was 53 BCE. Crassus stood at the head of 7 legions, over 30,000 Roman soldiers, and his confidence was absolute. He wasn't a young man anymore, but his pride burned like fire. As he gazed eastward across the Euphrates, he imagined a new Rome rising in the sands. He would rival Alexander the Great. He would bring home the treasures of Persia. And most importantly, he would finally stand shoulder to shoulder with Caesar and Pompey. But from the moment he crossed the river, the gods seemed to whisper warnings. His men were uneasy. The omens were bad. A priest tried to stop him, saying the sacrifices revealed disaster ahead. Crassus laughed it off. "We'll read better entrails in Parthia," he said. Even his allies begged him to reconsider. Artavasdes, the king of Armenia, offered to guide him through the mountains, away from the open plains where the Parthian cavalry ruled supreme. But Crassus refused. He didn't want to share his glory or his loot. So instead, he led his army straight into the desert. The heat was merciless. The sun turned armor into ovens. Men collapsed under the weight of their shields and packs. Their water ran low, their scouts disappeared. And then came the first signs of the enemy, dust clouds on the horizon, the faint glimmer of metal. Crassus assumed they were fleeing Parthian scouts. He was wrong. What emerged from the haze was not a scattered patrol, but a swarm, thousands of horse archers in gleaming armor, moving like waves over the sand. Their commander was Surena, the Parthian general, young, brilliant, and impossibly rich. He had fewer men than Crassus, but each one was trained for this terrain, born in the saddle. The Parthians didn't fight like Romans. They didn't march, didn't charge. They danced. The attack began suddenly, with a thunder of hooves and a scream of arrows, arrows that never seemed to stop. The Parthians fired, retreated, and fired again, always out of reach. Crassus ordered a charge, but his heavy infantry lumbered through the sand like beasts in chains. The cavalry that could have countered them had already been separated, led astray by deceit and misdirection. The Parthians had one devastating advantage. The Parthian shot, firing backward at full gallop, raining death even as they fled. Within hours, the desert became a graveyard. The sound of arrows was like rainfall, unending. Roman shields bristled with shafts. Soldiers collapsed in pools of blood and heat stroke, and still Crassus refused to retreat. Pride was more poisonous than any wound. By nightfall, thousands lay dead. The Parthians hadn't even closed for melee. They didn't need to. They circled and bled the Romans dry, vanishing into the dunes before the survivors could strike back. Crassus's army was collapsing not from defeat, but from exhaustion and disbelief. The next morning, the Parthians returned with even greater ferocity. In a desperate move, Crassus sent his son, Publius, forward with a cavalry force to flank them. It was a trap. Publius was surrounded, cut off, and annihilated. His head was severed and placed on a spear. Later that day, as the Parthians rode up to Crassus's lines, they threw the head at his feet. The richest man in Rome, watching the mutilated face of his own son, knew, perhaps for the first time, what true loss felt like. Still, he refused to surrender. Still, he clung to pride. Night fell over the battlefield like a shroud, and the desert wind howled through a wasteland of bodies. The cries of the wounded mingled with the hiss of dying fires. What had begun as a march for glory had turned into a march of ghosts. The once mighty Roman legions now huddled in silence, their shields cracked, their morale shattered. In the dim torchlight, Crassus paced among them, a hollow figure, his armor caked with dust, his eyes sunken with despair. The men no longer looked to him for courage, they looked at him with hatred. He had led them into hell for his own vanity. Some whispered curses, others plotted escape. The mighty army of Rome, 30,000 strong, was now little more than a starving mob stranded in enemy land. At dawn, the Parthians returned, fresh, laughing, untouched by the nightmare they had inflicted. Their drums beat slow and steady, mocking the exhausted Romans. The horse archers began their dance again, raining arrows from a distance while their drums echoed like a death march. Crassus ordered a retreat toward the town of Caere, hoping to regroup and survive the night. But the retreat quickly devolved into chaos. The columns splintered, supplies were abandoned, and the wounded were left behind. Parthian riders shadowed their every step, harassing the flanks, snatching stragglers, and cutting off escape routes. By the time they reached Caere, fewer than half of Crassus's men were still with him. Inside the city walls, there was no triumph, no strategy, only despair. Some officers begged him to surrender. Others urged a night escape through the mountains. Crassus hesitated, torn between fear and pride. The man who had once commanded fortunes now couldn't command his own destiny. In the darkness, betrayal brewed. Cassius, one of his senior officers, slipped away with a portion of the cavalry, abandoning Crassus and leaving the infantry trapped. When dawn came, Crassus awoke to find his camp in shambles and his allies gone. The Parthians, sensing the collapse, offered terms. They sent envoys under a flag of truce, promising safe passage if Crassus agreed to parley with Surena. His soldiers, desperate to live, begged him to accept. "Better chains than graves," one centurion muttered. Crassus finally relented. He and his generals rode out to meet the Parthians on the open plain. It was supposed to be a negotiation. Instead, it was a trap. As they approached, Surena's men surrounded them in a semicircle. The Parthian general greeted Crassus with elaborate courtesy, dismounting and offering his hand. But as Crassus reached out, confusion broke. An argument erupted. Then a scuffle. Someone shouted. A Roman lunged, and in an instant, the desert exploded into chaos again. Crassus's horse reared. His guards drew their swords, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Blades flashed, men screamed, and sand turned red. When the dust settled, Crassus was on the ground, wounded, disarmed, and dragged away by Parthian soldiers. Surena looked down at the trembling, bloodied figure of the Roman who had once thought himself invincible. There would be no ransom, no negotiation, only mockery. The richest man in Rome had finally been captured, not by a rival general or a cunning politician, but by his own arrogance. And the Parthians knew exactly how to end his story. They brought him to the Parthian camp at sunset. The sky burned crimson, the same shade as the blood he had spilled for ambition. Bound in chains, dust-covered and beaten, Marcus Licinius Crassus no longer looked like the richest man in Rome. He looked like a relic, his face swollen, his eyes hollow, his pride shattered. Around him, Parthian soldiers laughed and jeered, calling him the Golden Roman. Surena, the Parthian general, didn't want just victory. He wanted spectacle. He knew Crassus's reputation, his endless greed, his hunger for gold. So as the soldiers dragged Crassus before him, Surena decided to make his punishment poetic. He ordered a chair of bronze to be brought out. A pot of gold coins was melted over an open flame until the metal turned into a glowing, molten pool. The heat shimmered in the dry air. The Romans, who were still alive and captive, watched in silent horror as the liquid gleamed, a reflection of everything Crassus had ever lived for. As Surena approached, he spoke loudly, his words meant for every man in the camp to hear. "You wanted gold, Roman. Take your fill." The soldiers held Crassus down. He tried to resist, but his strength was gone. His mouth opened, not in defiance, but in despair. And then came the sound, the sickening hiss of molten metal meeting flesh. The gold was poured down his throat. His body convulsed, his skin blistered, his scream was swallowed by the bubbling hiss. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the metallic tang of wealth turned to death. His veins seemed to glow from within for a moment, as if the fire of his own greed had finally consumed him. It wasn't an execution. It was art, a message written in agony. The Parthians didn't stop there. According to ancient sources, they paraded Crassus's severed head through their cities. Some accounts say it was taken to the Parthian king, Orodes II, during a theatrical performance. The story goes that the head was presented on stage during a reenactment of the Bacchae, a tragedy about pride and downfall. The audience laughed, applauded, and cheered as the severed head of Rome's wealthiest man became part of the play. But whether that detail is truth or legend, the message was clear. Rome's greed had met its mirror. News of Crassus's death spread like wildfire through the Republic. The richest man in Rome, killed not with sword or spear, but with molten gold. To many, it was divine justice, a fitting end for a man who had worshipped wealth as if it were a god. Yet, like all great stories from history, the truth may be more complicated. Some historians argue that the tale of the molten gold was a later invention, a piece of propaganda meant to humiliate Rome. They say Crassus was killed in the chaos of his capture, his body mutilated and desecrated afterward. But the myth endured because it fit the man too perfectly. The death matched the sin. And that's why the story still burns centuries later, not because it's confirmed, but because it feels true. Crassus's death marked more than the end of one man. It marked the end of Rome's eastern ambitions for decades. The Parthians had humiliated the greatest empire on earth, and in doing so, they forged one of history's most enduring legends. Back in Rome, the news of Crassus's death struck like a thunderclap. The richest man in the Republic had been reduced to a grotesque legend. Whispers filled the Senate halls. Some sneered that he had choked on his own greed. Others trembled, knowing what his loss meant for Rome's delicate balance of power. The first triumvirate, Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey, had never been built on friendship. It was a triangle held together by convenience and mistrust. Crassus's gold had financed Caesar's conquests in Gaul. His influence had kept Pompey's ambitions in check, but now one corner of that fragile structure had vanished. And without Crassus's wealth and mediation, the alliance began to rot from within. Caesar was still campaigning in Gaul, sending back tales of endless victories and heaps of spoils. He had the loyalty of his legions and the love of the people. Pompey, meanwhile, sat in Rome, brooding, jealous, and surrounded by senators, whispering that Caesar's power had grown too great. The rivalry that Crassus's presence once kept in check was now a ticking bomb. Rome had lost not just a man, but a balance. The Parthian disaster at Carrhae haunted the Republic. More than 20,000 Roman soldiers had been killed or captured, one of the greatest defeats in the empire's history. The eagles of Rome, sacred symbols of legionary honor, were paraded by the Parthians as trophies. The humiliation burned deep. Crassus's ambition had not just destroyed himself, it had wounded Rome's pride. The eastern provinces whispered of revenge. But Rome was too busy devouring itself. In the years that followed, Caesar crossed the Rubicon, igniting civil war. Pompey fled, the Senate fractured, and the Republic bled out in the chaos that followed. In a twisted way, Crassus's death had been the first domino. His greed, his lust for glory, his refusal to accept his limits, they set off a chain reaction that ended with the Republic's corpse lying in Caesar's hands. Historians often call Crassus the third man of the triumvirate, but his absence proved how essential he truly was. He was the glue that held together two titans who hated each other. When that glue melted, along with the gold in his throat, Rome's fate was sealed. Even the Parthians couldn't have planned a more devastating consequence. By killing Crassus, they didn't just defeat an army, they helped destroy a civilization's greatest political experiment. Still, there's something haunting about Crassus's end. For a man who valued wealth above all, his death became the ultimate metaphor, a story repeated for centuries to remind humanity of greed's price. Whether or not molten gold ever touched his lips doesn't even matter. The legend carries more truth than any battlefield report. And it didn't stop with Crassus. His gruesome death became a symbol used throughout history. Medieval chroniclers, Renaissance painters, and modern writers all revisited it as a warning. When kings taxed their people to ruin, when merchants hoarded more than they needed, the phrase Crassus's fate echoed like a curse. He had wanted immortality through victory. Instead, he achieved it through horror. Time turned Crassus from a man into a myth. In the generations that followed, his name became shorthand for wealth corrupted by vanity. Roman historians like Plutarch and Cassius Dio retold his story not as a record of facts, but as a morality play. Each retelling added more fire, more symbolism, more cruelty. The molten gold wasn't just punishment, it was poetic justice, a caution carved into history. To later Romans, Crassus embodied everything they feared in themselves. The Republic had built its empire on discipline, restraint, and civic duty, but by Crassus's time, those virtues were rotting under the weight of greed. His death was a mirror, showing Rome what it had become. It wasn't just one man choking on molten gold, it was Rome choking on its own decadence. Even centuries later, his legend lived on. Medieval chroniclers in Europe used his story to warn kings and nobles against avarice. Illuminated manuscripts depicted his death in vivid detail, gold spilling like light from his mouth as demons waited to drag his soul away. The church embraced the tale as divine punishment. To them, Crassus wasn't just a Roman general. He was a moral parable dressed in armor. Renaissance painters later picked up the theme, fascinated by its theatrical brutality. In grand halls and shadowed chapels, they painted the moment the molten gold met flesh, the symbol of material greed turned into physical torment. Crassus's face became a canvas of agony and irony, his wealth transformed into his executioner. Even beyond Europe, the tale resonated. In Persia, the Parthians' descendants told it with pride, as proof that no empire, no matter how mighty, could humiliate them without consequence. For them, Crassus's end was not a tragedy, but a triumph, an Eastern victory over Western arrogance. Philosophers and writers, from Seneca to Machiavelli, referenced Crassus when discussing human ambition's darkest edge. Seneca, the Stoic, once wrote that he who is a slave to gold will find his master in death. Whether he meant Crassus or every man like him, the truth was the same. Greed consumes, then kills. By the modern era, Crassus's death had become more than history. It was metaphor. In literature and film, the Golden Death was used to describe the ultimate consequence of excess, how those who worship wealth eventually drown in it. It's echoed in corporate tragedies, political collapses, and even pop culture, a story so old, yet endlessly relevant. But what makes this legend truly powerful is that it transcends time. Whether molten gold ever touched Crassus's throat doesn't matter. The story endures because it feels inevitable. His end fits the crime too perfectly to be coincidence. He wasn't punished by his enemies. He was punished by his own reflection, and that's what gives the legend its bite. Because in every age, in every empire, there's a Crassus. Someone who believes they can buy immortality. Someone who confuses fortune with destiny. Someone who thinks the world is for sale. And history always finds a way to remind them otherwise. When Crassus fell, Rome lost more than a general. It lost its illusion of control. His death in the sands of Carrhae didn't just humiliate a nation. It revealed the cracks in the Republic's soul. The Roman dream of discipline and unity was dead, replaced by hunger, for power, for glory, for revenge. Caesar took that hunger and weaponized it. In the years that followed, his armies thundered westward, not to avenge Crassus, but to fill the void his death had left. The Parthians had robbed Rome of one of its symbols, and Caesar, ever the opportunist, used that outrage to solidify his image as Rome's true savior. But even as he rose, he carried a silent lesson from Crassus's fall. Ambition devours itself. Ironically, Caesar would meet his own brutal end not long after. Stabbed by men he called allies, dying under a statue of Pompey, the same Pompey who once stood beside Crassus in the triumvirate. 3 men bound by greed and shattered by it. Their alliance began in shared power and ended in shared ruin. The Republic never recovered. After Caesar came Augustus, and with him, the Empire. The Senate's voice faded into ceremony, and Rome became a monarchy in everything but name. The dream that men like Crassus claimed to protect was buried beneath the marble of a new order. But the Parthians, they remembered. For them, Carrhae became legend, a story of how the East had humbled the West. Long after Crassus's bones turned to dust, the Parthians displayed captured Roman standards as trophies, symbols of their defiance. It wasn't until decades later that Augustus negotiated their return. When those eagles finally came home, they weren't restored by blood, but by diplomacy, proof that even Rome had learned there were limits to conquest. Crassus's ghost, though, never left the empire he helped destroy. His name became a whisper in history's corridors, a lesson spoken in the same breath as words like hubris and folly. For generations, Roman generals remembered his mistake. Before marching east, they'd pause at temples, consult augurs, and mutter prayers that they wouldn't meet the same fate. Yet greed is a disease with no cure, and history repeated itself again and again. There's a cruel poetry to it all. Crassus sought eternal fame, but the fame he earned was of a different kind. His name lives not among Rome's heroes, but among its warnings. He chased wealth until it killed him, and the very gold he craved became his eulogy. In the end, Marcus Licinius Crassus didn't die in battle. He died of hunger, an endless, gnawing hunger for more. And that's why his story still haunts every era that measures success in gold instead of honor. Centuries after his death, the shadow of Marcus Licinius Crassus still lingered over Rome like a caution whispered in marble halls. His story was retold by senators, philosophers, and generals alike, not as a celebration, but as a sermon. Every time another statesman reached too far, every time a general defied the gods for ambition, Crassus's name surfaced again. "Remember Carrhae," they would say. "Remember the gold." The Romans, for all their grandeur, were obsessed with the idea of fate. They believed that the gods punished excess, hubris, with cruel precision. And Crassus's death fit that divine pattern too perfectly. A man who worshipped gold, killed by gold. A man who dreamed of immortality, remembered only for his death. Even the emperors who came after him, Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, carried that unease. They built temples and monuments to honor discipline, but their palaces glistened with the same gold Crassus once hoarded. The empire expanded, contracted, and eventually fell under the same disease that had destroyed him: greed without purpose. In many ways, Crassus's death marked the moment Rome began turning its eyes inward. The Republic had fallen not because of foreign armies, but because of men like him, men who valued personal glory over collective survival. He didn't just lose a battle, he symbolized the decay of Roman virtue itself. And yet, there's something deeply human about him. His story resonates not just as a condemnation, but as a mirror. Every age since Rome has had its Crassus. Men and women who believe they can conquer meaning with money, who mistake possession for power. The technology changes, the currency changes, but the hunger remains the same. Modern historians point out that Crassus wasn't the first rich man to chase immortality, nor the last. But his failure is timeless because it feels inevitable. When wealth becomes purpose, downfall becomes destiny. The gold he melted for others in his lifetime ultimately melted him. Even his enemies understood the weight of that irony. Parthian poets wrote songs of his fall, describing how his spirit, once wrapped in riches, wandered the desert naked. To them, his death wasn't just a victory. It was cosmic balance restored. In the end, the molten gold wasn't punishment. It was transformation. Crassus became the embodiment of a universal truth, that greed consumes everything it touches: wealth, honor, family, empire, until only ashes remain. His story, brutal and beautiful in its symmetry, reminds us that history's cruelest moments are often its most revealing. They show us who we are beneath the armor of civilization. They say the dead tell no tales. But Marcus Licinius Crassus has been telling his for over 2,000 years. Every time we hear about greed devouring greatness, his name flickers like a candle in the dark. The man who tried to buy glory was remembered instead for the moment he lost everything: his army, his family, his pride, and finally, his breath, stolen by the very metal he worshipped. The molten gold didn't just silence him, it immortalized him. The Parthians might have meant to mock him, but in doing so, they gave history one of its most haunting metaphors. His death became art, a warning, and a prophecy all at once. Because no matter how far civilization advances, how rich our cities grow, how powerful our empires become, the hunger that destroyed Crassus still burns in us. It's the same hunger that drives nations to war for resources, corporations to exploit for profit, and people to measure worth in numbers rather than meaning. His story isn't about Rome or Parthia, it's about humanity, about the line between ambition and obsession, and what happens when we mistake gold for godhood. Crassus thought his wealth made him untouchable, but in the end, it only made his fall louder. His death was not just punishment, it was poetry, the universe's cruel reminder that no fortune can buy immortality. His name outlasted his empire, not because he ruled, but because he was ruined. The desert that swallowed his army has long since changed. The Parthian Empire has crumbled into dust, but the story still glows, molten and eternal, warning every generation that follows. So, when you hear of empires built on greed, of men who believe they can buy their way into eternity, remember Crassus. Remember the gold. Remember how the richest man in Rome learned the poorest truth, that everything has a price. This has been Chronicles of Cruelty, where we unearth the most brutal stories from history. Tales of power, betrayal, and poetic justice. If you found this descent into Rome's darkest legend captivating, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more, and ring the bell so you never miss our next story from the shadows of time. Because as long as history remembers the greedy, the cruel, and the damned, we'll be here, telling their stories one molten truth at a time.